right now, and you'll have to click OK. Following this event, you'll be able to find a link to the recording on the event page on our website. In addition, I'm going to post in the chat, I'm going to post a link to the Oxford University Press website where you can buy a copy of the book. And with that said, I'll turn it over to our director, Bill Braniff.
Hi, good morning, everybody. Thanks so much for joining us. We are really fortunate today to be with three tremendous scholars from the field. And so I'm going to jump right into their biographies and turn the floor over to them. But again, thanks for spending your time with us today. We're joined today by Dr. Arie Kruglanski. He's a distinguished university professor at the University of Maryland. He's a recipient of several awards, including the National Institute of Mental Health Research Scientist Award, the Distinguished Scientific Contribution Award from the Society of Experimental Social Psychology, and the Donald Campbell Award for Outstanding Contributions to Social Psychology from the Society for Personality and Social Psychology. He's a fellow of the American Psychological Association and the American Psychological Society, and was a co-founder and presently is a senior investigator at START. Dr. David Weber is assistant professor at the L. Douglas Wilder School of Government and Public Affairs at Virginia Commonwealth University. His research examines the social psychological factors involved in the radicalization and de-radicalization processes, and he has worked in the fields of CVE program assessment and the training of CVE practitioners within prisons. Dr. Daniel Koehler is co-founder of the first peer-reviewed open access journal on de-radicalization, JD Journal for De-Radicalization, which he created together with his German Institute on Radicalization and De-Radicalization Studies colleagues. His work on terrorism, radicalization, and de-radicalization is regularly covered by leading international news outlets such as the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, Christian Science Monitor, National Public Radio, Rolling Stones Magazine, the Associated Press, and the London Society Times. He's also a research fellow at the new Polarization and Extremism Research and Innovation Lab at the Center for University Excellence of the American University in Washington, D.C., and a member of the editorial board of the International Center for Counterterrorism in The Hague. So thanks for joining us. We're really glad you can be here to present today, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Bill, and thank you all for joining us for this event. Daniel, David, and I are very honored and privileged to be here as guests of the START Institute and to share with you some of our insights and our findings about the phenomenon of neo-Nazism that is on the surge these very days and is experiencing an uptick during the corona pandemic. First, a few words about ourselves. David and I are professors of psychology. Daniel is a political scientist and security expert and the director of GIR, the German Institute of Radicalization and Radicalization. You may ask, what do psychologists have to do with neo-Nazism and violent extremism? And that's a very good question. Up until 9/11, I was very happy to limit my research to basic psychological problems studied in the laboratory with university undergraduates as participants, very comfortable and cozy, all within the confines of the university, never had to travel much. But 9/11 changed all that. I was asked to serve on a National Academies of Science panel on terrorism, and the rest is history. Along with colleagues, Gary Lafree and others, we competed for a Center for Excellence funded by the Department of Homeland Security. There were 70 universities competing, and for some strange quirk of fate, we won. And again, you know, the rest is history. The START Center has been one of the most important global centers for the study of terrorism and the response to terrorism. And under its auspices, we carried out research in various parts of the globe, wherever violent extremists can be found in the Middle East, East Asia, South Asia, Europe, the United States, and everywhere else where they can be found, and they can be found anywhere. About 7 years ago, on a lecture tour of Canada, I met a very promising graduate student, David Weber, who was just about to finish his dissertation. Again, experimental research. And I immediately corrupted him and lured him to leave the comfortable coziness of the laboratory and join me on this journey into all kinds of dangerous places. He's been traveling to Africa and Asia and everywhere else. We started a very fruitful collaboration, one of which outcomes is the present book, but many other projects that are ongoing and have been published. I also was my great fortune to meet Daniel Koehler at a conference in Trier in Germany, a conference on law and psychology. I was very impressed with his work, with his background. He was at that time, I think, the research director of Exit Germany before he founded his own Institute of Grid. We decided to collaborate on a data set that Daniel collected on German neo-Nazis. If you can have the first slide, please. Essentially, this book is based on research that is founded on in-depth interviews with about 40 German Nazis who decided to leave the movement after years of participation. We were particularly interested in their journey, as the book implies. Slide 2, please. What made them join? What was their life on the inside of the movement? Why in the world did they decide to leave? And finally, how did they fare on the outside back into the fold of the mainstream German society? And as psychologists, we're specifically attempting to understand what psychological factors drove our interviews and interviewees through this fateful journey to the edge and back. Now, these very days, the neo-Nazis and other white supremacist movements are enjoying great uptick, great popularity on both sides of the Atlantic, and they are launching a rising wave of attacks against various minorities and against governments. An interesting bit of data is that the far-right terrorist attacks in the last 5 years increased by no less than 320%, according to the 2019 Global Terrorism Index. In 2018 alone, far-right attacks were about 3 times the number of Islamist attacks. What are we to do about this growing threat? Slide 3, please. Many people choose to see the neo-Nazis as evil. And doing so, viewing them as evil is perhaps well-deserved, but it's not necessarily helpful. What they do is reprehensible, no question, but calling them evil has a kind of essentialism, has a kind of finality to it that limits our options. To think somebody is evil means that they're unchangeable, irredeemable, corrupt to the root, incorrigible. Perhaps the only thing that you can do with evil is to annihilate it, fight it tooth and nail. But fighting fire with fire, although sometimes it's necessary, also exacts a heavy price in perpetuating the cycle of violence. And for one instance, the global war on terror, now it's in 20th year, hasn't been too successful. And the various terrorist movements and organizations like Al-Qaeda and ISIS, despite the defeat of the caliphate, are still operating, still attractive to many thousands of followers, still carrying out attacks, and still very much a movement to be reckoned with. But what is the alternative? What can we do? To answer that question, it is important first to understand what makes them tick, to understand the psychology of violent extremism. And over the last 2 decades or so, our team has carried out extensive research with thousands of terrorists and others at the risk of radicalization. On the basis of these data and on the basis of work of many important theorists and scholars that have been studying it for decades, the scholars like Scott Atran, like Ted Gore, like Mark Sageman, who contributed a lot to the insights, we integrated their insights with our data and came up with a theory of radicalization that contains 3 prongs, the 3N theory of radicalization. And we applied this theory to the sample of neo-Nazis that we studied, that Daniel interviewed. What are these 3 N's? The 3 N's are, the first N is the narrative, the need that motivates people to join the neo-Nazi movement or any extremist movement. After all, people are motivated. They do not do things without a reason. And it's very important to understand the root, the motivational root of their joining an extremist organization. The second N is the narrative. What is the narrative? What is the ideological narrative? Not ideology in any grand sense, but what is the rationale? What is the logic? Why do they think that joining the movement will satisfy their need for doing so? So there is a logic. People are sentient beings. They go by some cognitive rationale for what it is that they're doing. And the third important element is the network. The network is the group of people who validate the narrative, who embrace the narrative, who say that the narrative whereby violence is the way of gaining significance is valid. And the network is also the group that bestows honor and respect and a recognition on people who follow the narrative. If we can get to the next slide, please. Let me unpack those 3 N's a little bit. The first N is the narrative, is the need, the motivation behind individuals' desire and motivation to join. Now, this need for significance and recognition is fundamental and universal. It's hardly specific to the neo-Nazis or to any extremists. As the late humanist Jean Vernier remarked, all of us have a secret desire to be seen as saints, heroes, and martyrs. The desire for recognition and significance is one of the most important, most central human needs. From our infancy, the infant vies for attention because otherwise it will not survive. Adult humans also vie for recognition and respect. Nobody wants to be undignified. Nobody wants to be disrespected. And this is not a new idea. Major social thinkers from Aristotle through Hegel, Marx, Sartre, or George Herbert Mead emphasized the struggle for recognition as a major force in social revolutions and social movements, including the Russian Revolution, the American Revolution, the French Revolution, movements for equality, for civil rights, for gay rights, for feminist rights, etc. At the root of it is this desire for recognition, the desire for dignity. So an individual may join the neo-Nazi movement because they suffered a loss of significance. They suffered a humiliation, or because they were enticed by the boost to significance, gaining great empowerment, great significance by joining this powerful, brutal movement that everybody fears. So here is the question, however. If the quest for significance is so universal, how come only a very small proportion of the people join an extremist organization like the neo-Nazi movement or like the jihadist movements that we have seen? And the answer lies in the 2 remaining N's of our 3N triumvirate, the narrative and the network. If I can have the next slide, please. The narrative identifies what one needs to do in order to gain significance. In plain English, the neo-Nazi narrative tells individuals that in order to significance, they need to fight the presumed enemies of the Aryan race, the presumed enemy of the German states that should belong to the Aryan race. And who are these enemies? The usual suspects, the Jews, the Muslims, the refugees, the immigrants, the government, who is globalist, internationalist, who collaborates with international Zionism and the Western powers that suppress the people, the folk. So defending one's race, one nation, one religion is hailed as a kind of moral imperative whose value is bestowed on those who serve it, and therefore bestows significance upon people who are ready to pick up a gun, pick up a baseball bat, pick up a knife, and attack the enemies of the race. Now you can see why not all persons become neo-Nazis, although all persons have this need for significance. Different people may subscribe to very different ideological narratives as to how significance can be attained. And those narratives may simply feature different values. Rather than religiosity, race, or ethnicity, they may highlight the value of achievement. You become significant if you achieve, if you contribute to society, if you're wise, if you are beautiful, if you are wealthy, if you're successful. And of course, these different narratives identify a different way of serving the value. For instance, through hard work, through exercise, having a job, cosmetics to make you beautiful, the gym to make you look great, or whatever else other than violence. Finally, the third N in our triumvirate, a slide please, is the network. It is your in-group, it's your reference group, the people who you respect and whose respect and good opinion you seek. We are social beings. We need the validation of others. We need recognition from other people. This again is not a new idea. And you know, we only need respect from people who are important to you. You do not gain respect by having kids recognize you, because kids do not have an opinion that really matters to you. You do not care about the opinion of people who you feel are inferior. You feel about, you seek the good opinion of people you care about. And again, this is not a new idea, but it's a very valid idea. That's why networks are so important. That's why people like Mark Sageman emphasized the importance of the network. And now we see how it integrates with the notions of the narrative, which ensconce the values. Scott Atran talked about sacred values. Well, the network validates the values and both serve the quest for significance. So the 3N is an integrative model that both is supported by zillion of data, but also it builds on insights and understandings contributed by other great social scholars. So these are the 3Ns. This is the introduction to our book that is specifically about the German context. And I would like now to invite Daniel Koehler, who is one of the world's greatest experts on the German neo-Nazi and CVE context, to talk about what is special about Germany in this particular regard.
Thank you, Arie, for this great introduction, and thanks to the people at START for hosting this book talk. Really excited to share my and our experience here. So can I have the next slide, please? As the book is about German right-wing extremism, essentially what makes people join and leave German neo-Nazi or far-right groups. I think it's good for you all to give you a little bit of background on the German situation, which might differ a little bit from what you know, or from the US situation, North American situation. So Germany has basically since the end of the Second World War had a continuous tradition of violent, militant, far-right groups. And when I say far-right, I really mean former Nazis, neo-Nazis, fascists, white supremacists, racists, so the most extreme end of the right-wing spectrum of politics. Now, obviously, after the Second World War, former actual Nazis, former members of the Nazi Party, of the SS, SA, so the core Nazi organizations, the Gestapo, obviously still, many of them still lived in Germany, and some of them tried to reorganize and try to basically make possible that an official Nazi party could be reestablished. That was the first main goal. And then, of course, these old former Nazis recruited new people into their groups and organizations and their political parties. So that was the route after the Second World War, that the far-right extremist movement in Germany survived and kept on developing and branching out into different areas. Obviously, a lot has happened since then, and the German authorities have fought back and forth with the far-right environment. There were waves of far-right violence. Essentially every decade in Germany after the Second World War has seen its dedicated right-wing terrorist groups, campaigns, and attacks. To give you just a little bit of background in terms of numbers, today, as of today in Germany, we see statistically 2 to 3 violent extreme right-wing hate crimes. So every day, 2 to 3 people are attacked, violently attacked by neo-Nazis or white supremacists. The German authorities estimate the organized neo-Nazi movement or the organized white supremacist movement at about 24,000 individuals in Germany, a country of about 80 million inhabitants. And of these 24,000, roughly half, so 13,000, are considered to be violent or highly violent, highly risk of violent or terrorist activities. So this is roughly the organized militant far-right milieu we are looking at in Germany. We obviously have far-right parties, political parties. We have a very large subcultural environment involving not only skinhead groups, but many, many other groups that branch to us from the US. We have an own version of the Ku Klux Klan, of the Aryan Brotherhood, you name it. So basically any US white supremacist organization, we have a version of that. And obviously there are also European groups like Identitarian Movement, Generation Identity, for example, which branched out to the US. So there's a lot of international exchange between the militant organized far right. In 2011, for example, there was a moment which the German Federal Prosecutor General called Our 9/11. And that was when a group calling itself the National Socialist Underground, the NSU, was discovered by chance, by accident, actually. This was a small cell of 3 neo-Nazis, 2 men and a woman, which obviously had a much larger support network. But this cell had been actively killing and bombing people for over a decade. They went underground in the late 1990s, and they murdered and bombed undiscovered for over a decade. And that happened in 2011 when this group was discovered. And the German authorities started to massively reorient and started to understand that the violence and threats from the far right might have been underestimated. Since then, there were a number of other counter-terrorist investigations and attacks, and I just want to name 3 of those, which I find extremely important to show you some of the most recent developments. In June 2019, a high-ranking German politician, Walter Lübcke, who was a regional president, was shot at point-blank range by a neo-Nazi. This was the most high-level political assassination of a neo-Nazi in post-Second World War Germany. In October 2019, another neo-Nazi of a different kind, more of an international online racist and anti-Semitic conspiracy theorist, started to attack the synagogue in Halle. He wanted to break into the synagogue and kill as many members of the Jewish community as possible at the Yom Kippur holiday. He built his own weapons and he live streamed the attack online, as, for example, the attacker in New Zealand did. And then thirdly, in Hanau in February 2020, another racist motivated conspiracy theorist drove by and shot 10 people with an immigration background and then his own mother before he committed suicide. Now, what we see in recent years in German right-wing terrorism is basically a surge of all forms of violence. We see organized hardcore neo-Nazi groups splintering off and building small clandestine terrorist cells, attacking synagogues or mosques or plotting to assassinate politicians. We also saw something that I have called in my research hive terrorism, which is essentially people without any previous background or connection to an organized extremist movement who become engaged in far-right terrorist plots. Now, this is something of an enigma for the German authorities because these individuals have never been popped up on their radar. So they have not appeared on far-right rallies or any organized neo-Nazi groups, but still they very quickly come engaged in far-right violence and terrorist plots. Now, this is a different topic for a different day, but I just want to alert you that there are many, many different developments bringing people to a level of potential far-right motivated violence. Can I have the next slide, please? So what to do about it? What's the German response? I don't know if there is the German response because Germany is a very federal country and all the different states have roughly also different policies and responses. But naturally, Germany has made a lot of experience when it comes to countering violent extremism or de-radicalization, exit programs, whatever you want to call it. Actually, Germany started the first de-radicalization or exit program or reintegration program for terrorist offenders in the late 1980s, targeting far-left terrorists of the Red Army faction. At that time, representatives of the German Domestic Intelligence Service actually reached out to left-wing terrorists and tried to convince them to come back, share their stories, and then actually reintegrate into society. Now, this program was running to the late 1990s, and after the German reunification in 1990, we had a massive upsurge in far-right violence, arson attacks, explosive attacks, assassinations. And the first reaction of the German government was, of course, put as many people behind bars as possible. But as they found out that most of these perpetrators were adolescents, teenagers, and radicalized skinheads, etc., they also started to fund wide-scale youth social work programs to get these youngsters away from these neo-Nazi groups. And this was the root, basically, for today's CVE landscape, which is, from my perspective, the most far-reaching, best-funded, and diverse CVE landscapes in the world. Currently, as of today, German authorities estimate that there are over 1,500 active CVE projects in Germany. Many of those, roughly half of those, are run by the government. So we have intelligence services, police services, social agencies, educational agencies and ministries running de-radicalization and CVE programs of various scales. We have a vibrant and dynamic civil society landscape with many NGOs who engage in different types of de-radicalization and CVE work. And the government actually is putting a significant amount of funding into that landscape. Annually, the Federal Interior Ministry and the Family Ministry are putting between 150 and 200 million euros into that CVE landscape only for NGOs. You have to add to that all the governmental programs and initiatives that are running at the site. When it comes to far-right de-radicalization programs, every German state and the federal level, they have their own government-run de-radicalization programs, and many of them have civil society-based de-radicalization programs as well. So we have over 2 decades when the first neo-Nazi de-radicalization programs started in 2000, basically leveling up the initiatives of primary prevention that were started in the 90s. So we have over 20 years of practical de-radicalization work in Germany when it comes to neo-Nazis. Now, this is something that most Western countries far lag behind. And it's not all cake here in Germany, and it's not all very happy and successful. It's a lot of hard work, it's a lot of learning, it's a lot of different approaches that compete and need to be aligned. And obviously a federal approach brings with it that there are many different players and actors working on the same issues. So obviously there are pros and cons of that, but still it gives you a lot of infrastructure experience, practical work on the ground that helps people to leave neo-Nazi movements. So today, if you're a neo-Nazi in Germany and you're really fed up with it, and David will explain to us in a minute why they actually are fed up with it, You have many different programs on many different sides, governmental, non-governmental, police, intelligence, social work, that actually help you to get out at any given time. So this is really where we are in Germany right now. And with this, I want to pass over the staff to David and really dive with us into the data and the analysis that we did for our book. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniel. And thank you to the START Center. I'll just echo kind of sentiments Arie and Daniel had both said. Thank you for inviting us here to share our work with you. Now that you've heard from Arie a little bit about the framework that we use to guide our research, and from Daniel about the context in Germany, I'm going to talk with you a little bit about the approach we had and the research we conducted in Germany to understand the radicalization and de-radicalization of far-right members. If you want to go to the next slide, please. In our book, we present the results of analyses that we conducted with 35 interviews with former members of right-wing organizations. Let me start by telling you a little bit about who these people were that we spoke to. About 80% of the people that we interviewed were men. That's not that surprising. That's a fairly representative gender split of what we would expect to see in far-right organizations, both here in the US, but also in Europe. So fairly representative sample. All of the members that we spoke to had what we would call our sustained careers within the extremist movement. What that means is we wanted to make sure the people we were talking to were fully dedicated, fully committed, and had fully radicalized. We didn't want to talk to people who maybe joined in their young rebellious years to party and listen to hate music and then dropped out right away. We wanted people who were fully committed to the ideology behind the far-right movement. And so that's who we spoke to. And as a result of that, a majority of the people that we interviewed had actually risen to leadership positions within their respective organizations. Now, in the interviews, we touch on the 4 phases of their journey that you see on the screen. So we've dedicated a chapter in the book to each one of these phases. So entry, trying to understand the radicalization process, how these people came to join far-right movements. The second phase, we have kind of a belonging phase, what life was like for them on the inside, living in this kind of counterculture, in this extreme movement in Germany. Third phase is then leaving. What led them to make the decision? After being within an extreme movement for 10, 15 years, why did they ultimately come to leave that movement? And then finally, a phase that, if you're familiar with research, is relatively understudied in terrorism and extremism research, is the aftermath. So after they've left the movement, they're trying to reintegrate back into mainstream society. What is their life like for them at that point? And like I said, in the book, we devote chapters to each one of these phases. For the purpose of this talk, I'm going to try to highlight maybe 1 or 2 really interesting findings pertinent to each one of these phases. As I do so, as I go along, I'm going to provide you with quotes from the interviews. This is the story, it's their story that we're telling, so I want to make sure that we have their words in the talk. A natural place to then start is at the beginning, to start with why they came to join the far-right movement. And what we found, I should acknowledge first that we didn't simply just come out and ask them, oh, why did you join? If they offered that information, we looked at it, but we took more of a narrative approach. A lot of research has shown us that individuals cannot correctly identify their true reasons for why they engage in certain behaviors. So instead of directly asking them that, we asked them to explain what their life was like prior to joining the movement, and then we could analyze those statements to identify factors and circumstances that may have facilitated their movement, their joining into the movement. And what we found was that life was often very difficult for these individuals. We found that the most commonly occurring circumstance that these individuals had experienced is what we would call our abusive or neglectful relationships. And this was true for 60% of the people that we spoke to. To be clear, the relationship partner in this relationship didn't matter. So for some, it was abusive relationships with parents. Others, it was with their fellow schoolmates. Other individuals with teachers. Some people had very specific negative interactions with foreigners. That didn't really matter. What did matter was that whoever the relationship partner was, it was the feeling or the emotional experience that this caused in them. So time and time again, what they were telling us was that as a result of these abusive and neglectful relationships, they felt insignificant, they felt alone, and they felt humiliated. And as a result, they ultimately came to view neo-Nazi organizations as a place where they could finally fit in and they could finally feel like they would matter in their lives. We had people talk about being beaten by their mother. Just to give you a quote, as long as I can remember and comprehend, my mother just hit us. For even the smallest mistake, we got a beating. There really didn't even have to be a reason. I never experienced a level of emotional love between me and my mother. Okay. Another person recounted being bullied at school. A third individual talked about how they had absentee parents. So parents who were so busy running a business and trying to provide for their family that they were unable to provide him with the love and the attention and time that he felt like he needed. If you want to go to the next slide, please. This specific instance, this kind of absentee parent, is relatively striking here because it echoes eerily very similar to a circumstance of the individual that you see on your screen. This is Christian Picciolini. He's an American skinhead. And in his memoir, Romantic Violence, he recounted a very similar experience. As you can see, I longed for my mom and dad while they were away at work. I wanted to be with them, unsure why they were always absent. Still, I wasn't enough. I simply couldn't compete with their steadfast pursuit of the American dream, right? So it appears we may have not only kind of identified these abusive negative relationships as important in movement into German far right, but it's something that appears to be important into the American far right as well. Now, these negative circumstances provide that motivational push to want to join an extreme movement as a way to feel significant. But as Arie said earlier, to understand why people chose the right wing specifically, we need to look at the other ends of our model. We need to look at the social networks and we need to look at the narratives because these are what funnel or direct your motives towards a specific outlet. And the picture that was painted for us, if you want to go to the next slide, was that these individuals were, as it says in the screen, raised in hate. Okay, they were raised in environments where Nazism and bigoted views were commonplace and encouraged. Okay? So some of the people recognize that subtle racism exists kind of everywhere in society, but they felt that the communities in which they were raised in, it wasn't so subtle. It was much more explicit and much more overt. In many cases, it was actually family members where they were raised by, grandparents who were formerly members of the Nazi regime, who regaled them with positive stories about positive experiences and positive values that were embedded in them as their time in the movement. Right? And as a result, these individuals came to glorify the Nazi regime and that time, and they came to seek that out within neo-Nazi organizations. More than just being raised in hate, though, we also found that a common entry point into the movement was direct contact with other individuals, and specifically through the white power or the hate music scene. And music would be shared with them. These people, many of them radicalized in their youth, kind of high school age, and music would be shared with them in the schoolyard by peers, and this would be their introduction to the far right. Just to give you a quote, someone would bring a Casio cassette player and we listened to Lanzer or Stahlgewitter. These are two white power bands in the worst of sound qualities. Another would bring a case of beer and we'd simply sit there shouting along with the lousy music. That was what life was all about, right? So they have this motivation, they're searching for significance, and then in their environment, they're exposed to narratives that tell them this is a specific way that you can earn significance. This is who you should blame for your circumstances that you're in. And then they're embedded within these networks of other individuals that validate and also justify these beliefs. And through those mechanisms, it directs their need for significance towards the right-wing movement. Okay. Now, that covers entry into the movement. But what was life like for these individuals after they've joined the far right? What our interviews revealed is an interesting dichotomy for us. So on one hand, the interviewees were talking about the positive experiences that they had in the movement. So the movement was fulfilling their need for significance, their need for empowerment that they so desperately sought. Okay. But on the other hand, life in the movement was difficult for them. And it was filled with anxiety, it was filled with violence, and it was filled with personal struggles. Now, we didn't solicit this from them. These are just things that they had told us, but 70% of the people that we interviewed talked about how belonging in the movement provided them with a sense of camaraderie or community. 70% also talked about how they felt as a member, they were achieving important ideological goals. And then 70% also said that by actively participating within the right-wing movement, it made them feel significant and it made them feel important. Okay. If you want to go on to the next slide. This is a quote from an individual that gives you a specific example of how this need for significance or empowerment was fulfilled. And what's being depicted here is we had an individual who would engage in like a daily affirmation procedure, where this individual kept a picture of Hitler on her bedside table, and every morning when she would wake up, she would go through this daily affirmation to tell herself that her life had meaning and value, right? And as you can see on the screen, Hitler became a kind of God. Every morning when I woke up, I would look at this picture and I swore to live my life true to the slogan, one people, one empire, one leader. I kept having thoughts of what it would be like if the Fuhrer were still alive. He would have been proud of it, right? So this is just one striking example of how they look at their time in the movement, their activities in the movement, and they're assessing their life as, yes, this is something that is truly making me feel meaningful and important, feel like I have a purpose in life. Next slide. Now, the other half of that dichotomy, like I said, was it wasn't just positive. There was this trouble in paradise. Despite the sense of significance that serving the Nazi ideology afforded them, life inside the milieu was far from a blissful tranquility. Okay? And we specifically identified two negative types of experiences and circumstances that really defined life in the movement. The first of these was discrimination, and the second was violence. Discrimination, the idea here is that these individuals, although they are responsible for victimizing other people, about half of the people we had spoke to directly engaged in violence, they also viewed themselves as victims. So by choosing to be a member of the far right, they had essentially put a target on their back, and they felt hostility, and they felt what they thought was unfair treatment as a result of making that choice. When people found out they were members of the far right, they were fired from jobs, they were forced to leave the military, their children would lose friends or would be disinvited from birthday parties when it became aware that who their parents were. One of the more interesting examples for me was they even felt discriminated against or victimized when it came to their activism and their demonstrations. So one individual recounted how he saw how Muslim activists were able to go through the streets in their demonstrations and shout anti-Semitic slurs and slogans, but how the neo-Nazis were not allowed to do that. So at every facet of their behavior, they felt like they were being victimized, and they felt that they were being discriminated against. Now, I also want to point out that this kind of negative discrimination didn't only come from without, but it also came from within, specifically for our the female members, because of the toxic masculinity that pervades the far-right organizations. Women were openly discriminated against. Again, let me give you a quote from one of the women we spoke to. You won't find single women in a higher position inside the movement. Women are only a man's accessory. As soon as a woman starts acting on her own or thinking freely, they get put in their place by men. Thinking is not part of the job. Women have to obey. That's what men want them to do. Okay, so discrimination both from society, but if you're a woman member, also discrimination from your own comrades. Next slide. Now, the other component that I said, it wasn't just discrimination, it was also violence. So although these individuals were perpetrators of violence, they were also victims of violence. And what was interesting was when they were victims, the violence was often at the hands of their own comrades. Right? So of course they were getting in violent scuffles with members of the left wing, with foreigners, with immigrants, and they're perpetrators of violence, and sometimes they would experience violence in those cases. But for the most part, overwhelmingly, violence was directed against them by their own comrades. And this took two forms. In the early parts of their career, violence was initiation or hazing. It was something done to toughen them up, to prepare them for the fight. Let me give you a quote again. The older members would just punch out the younger members for no reason, or headbutt or break their nose or things like that. It was often justified with arguments like, We have to toughen you guys up for the fight so that you know what it's like to be in a fight and you can show here and now that you're men enough to take it. Right? So violence was very instrumental as a way to prepare people and to increase their commitment to the movement early on. Now, later on in their careers, towards the twilight of their careers, violence took a very different form. Essentially what had happened is these individuals had started to express what you might call like flagging enthusiasm for the movement. Sometimes they started to go to less meetings, they started to show up to less demonstrations, and their comrades would pick up on that. And they would notice that, and they were so suspicious that they would betray the movement that they reacted violently against their own members of the movement. And thus it was really common for individuals to experience threatening phone calls, to receive death threats, to be placed under surveillance. So they were secretly followed by their comrades around the city to try and determine who they were talking to. One individual who was imprisoned for his crimes was actually attacked by other neo-Nazis in prison, and the people who came to his rescue were foreigners. Another individual recounted how he had to barricade himself inside his apartment while his former comrades tried to kick down his door with combat boots, right? And ultimately what we see is that, yes, they did at one point get community, they get an ideology, they did get a sense of belonging and significance, right? But eventually all of these negative circumstances really started to take a toll on them, and it took a toll on their lives. So to give you, again, a quote, this is what one of the individuals we spoke to told us: "Few people can continue to live life like this year after year without becoming emotionally and physically burnt out. The negative aspects of being stigmatized, socially isolated, always exposed to violent attacks from opponents, and consumed by intense hatred for various enemies also tend to take a toll as their time passes by." Okay? And so as a result, these individuals ultimately end up leaving the movement. I would say, caution necessarily, we don't necessarily want to feel too sympathetic, depending on your perspective. They did make a choice to join a violent movement. So some of these kind of repercussions are what we would expect to happen from joining that movement. If you want to go to the next slide. And eventually these negative experiences end up leading them to lose faith in the ideology. Okay? Their relationships with their brothers in arms are falling apart. The movement is not accomplishing its goals. So as a result, they're not getting that sense of significance that they once got. And eventually this leads them to start to question the belief system. In our interviews, this took kind of two different forms. Some people shed their belief entirely. They started to question everything about the neo-Nazi ideology. As you can see, someone came to view it as a house of cards. Another person called it an illusory world that was built on lies. One person referred to it as the greatest superstition of the 20th and 21st century, right? Others individuals didn't kind of break with the ideology entirely, but they started to question and disagree with specific aspects of it. And this was really interesting for us because not all experts who study de-radicalization and disengagement agree with this. A lot of people believe that people leave these movements, but they retain the toxic views and beliefs. But that didn't appear to be the case for the people we spoke to. They did shed their belief system. And the way that this happened, it was a very gradual process for them. I like to think of their belief system as being like a foundation or a bedrock of what's going on. And every time a new negative circumstance would pop up, there would be a new crack that would form in that bedrock. They could repair that crack, they could ignore it, and they could move on with their lives. But as new circumstances piled up, new cracks formed to the point where they were no longer insurmountable, they could no longer be ignored, and that foundation, their belief system, did start to crumble. And as a consequence, everybody that we spoke to ended up leaving the movement. If you want to go to the next slide. And that brings us to the final phase. They've left. What is life like for them in the aftermath after having left? The interviewees here reported feeling isolated and rudderless in the absence of an ideology, okay? And they felt, as you can see on the screen, feelings of insignificance at a rate 5 times higher than during the other phases. So we read the interviews and we tried to code for times when they expressed these feelings of insignificance prior, during, and after having left the movement. And we found that these mentions increase are 5 times, 6 times greater relative to those other times in the movement. Now, what do we see overall, their life in the movement? Overall, generally speaking, the hardships, the grievances that they experienced have significantly declined. So overall, their life has improved after leaving the movement. But the unfortunate news, again, is this increase in insignificance that skyrockets after the movement. And what's happening here, again, they've lost their community. They've started to question their ideology. They've lost who they are. And as a result, they start to feel insignificant. Let me just use their own words again to give you a sense of what this was like. If you want to go to the next slide. This is a quote again from someone. You ask yourself what comes afterwards. You actually need a completely new life. All your friends are gone. Your goals are gone. What do you do with yourself? Everything that your everyday life consisted of is gone. Right? One more example. Here's another individual. I really felt like I was plunging into a deep, dark hole. I was 25 years old, and for the first time ever, I had no ideology, no worldview, no rationale. The first 24 years of my life were in shambles. I eventually reached a point where I tried to end it all because I had nothing left. Now, so what we're seeing here is that our way of understanding this is that those same mechanisms that allowed them to engage in violence and to live a sustained career within the movement were gone, right? The narrative in the network, by telling people this type of violence is okay, and if you engage in this type of violence, you will be rewarded for it. And then by embedding yourself within a network of individuals who engage in violence and justify violence, you have built-in protection mechanisms to prevent yourself from feeling guilty, from feeling shamed for your actions of violence against others. When you've left the movement and you've shed these mechanisms, there's nothing else there to protect you. And the individuals were overcome with this wash of feeling disgusting, feeling unworthy, and a sense of self-hatred because they could no longer cope with the negative actions that they had undertaken as members. And they were struggling trying to live a life without having a meaning in life, without having social connections or relationships. And they were really, really struggling at this time. And if you want to go to the next slide, what's really interesting is how do they cope with these pressures? Right? These same feelings of insignificance that they're experiencing now after having left the movement are the same feelings of insignificance that they felt that kind of drove them to join the right-wing movement in the first place, right? So now that they're feeling these feelings again, maybe the easiest recourse for them is to go back to the right-wing movement and to re-engage in violence. At one point, that movement provided them with community, provided them with meaning, provided them with an ideology and a purpose in life, right? They can go back to that thinking, hoping that they can find those things again now that they're struggling to find them when they're reintegrating in a normal society. And as a result, research shows us that about 25% of extremists and terrorists do end up re-engaging with violence. Others end up coping with this insignificance in other ways. Some people coped with it in ways that allowed them to kind of earn significance in a personal or individual way. So instead of trying to feel significant by fighting for a group, they tried to start a family for themselves, or they went back and got an education, or they worked on their career, and they tried to feel significant in ways that were personal and individual. Other individuals tried to fight what we call is the right fight on this screen. They used their experience in the movement and they tried to use it for good. So they started to, much like Christian Picciolini that I referenced earlier here in the US, they wrote memoirs, speaking out against the far right, telling their story. They took speaking engagements where they would speak to youth to try and dissuade them from joining the movement. Other individuals joined these disengagement programs in the very diverse CVE landscape that Daniel referenced. So they joined these groups and they tried to play a role in helping pull people out of these movements, right? And so some people cope with it in difficult ways, but others were able to turn this negative experience into something that was positive and to try and prevent the movement from expanding and help people pull out. That really is, like I said, kind of a high-level overview of some of the really interesting findings that we had at these different phases. So I'll throw it back to Arie really quick again for some concluding statements.
Thank you, David. So as you can see, the neo-Nazi experience, the way it was reflected in the interviews that we have coded, has not been a happy one, to say the least. It was suffused with suffering it was suffering that brought them into the ranks of the movement. A different kind of suffering greeted them on the inside. And when they finally got out, their experience was again suffused with suffering, feelings of guilt, feelings of futility, feelings of having wasted their lives, and so forth. So, you know, the journey turns out to be full of sound and fury, signifying nothing, to quote Macbeth. They had one advantage, and that is their experience in the movement, and they could contribute, like David pointed out, by carrying the right fight, by being at the lead of the counter-violent extremist movement. And several individuals that we know actually have made an important career doing that. Christian Picciolini is a leading figure in the CVE movement in the United States. Sammy Rango is leading the Exit USA movement, Life After Hate. Robert Orell, formerly of the Exit Sweden movement, has been also contributing in that way. So, you know, they have an experience that is unique and that they can be very persuasive to other people, more persuasive than maybe individuals who have not experienced it on their own bodies, on their own psyche. Of course, this carrying out the fight against the far right is in and of itself not an easy thing to do. It's fraught with dangers. They put the target on their back. As David pointed out, their erstwhile colleagues want to do them harm, physical harm, harm themselves, their families, and so forth. So it's not an easy task to undertake, but it's an important one. I would like to end with two comments concerning the future. The question is, what can we see happening to the neo-Nazi movement in Germany, but also elsewhere this day and age? You know, we know that in Germany, for the first time, a far-right party has become part of the German parliament. They have 97 posts in the German Bundestag, and they've been having electoral successes in Thuringia and other places. So one possible idea would be that this domesticates the far right, puts them into the mainstream, and that's going to reduce the violence. And there was actually a research paper by Jakob Ravendal in 2016 that reported a negative correlation between violent far-right events and the popularity of far-right parties, which would suggest domestication. But in fact, what we see seems to be the opposite, despite the fact that the Alternative for Deutschland is in the Bundestag. The amount of attacks is not subsiding. We have had the attacks that Daniel mentioned in Kassel, in Halle, in Hanau, just this last year. And the overall uptick, 320% in the last 5 years, doesn't bode well for the domestication hypothesis. Another issue of interest is how does the coronavirus pandemic affect the far right? And again, the news isn't good. In terms of our analysis, the pandemic introduces a sense of anxiety, a sense of disempowerment in everybody. It conveys the fragility that we have. We can contract it, we can become very ill, we can die, our loved ones can die. And to address this sense of fragility that the coronavirus produces, people are very attracted to ideologies that are empowering, that identify the culprits, the conspiracy theories, the ways of attack to a society that's now been incapacitated. And of course, another worry that is now surfacing is the restraints against the pandemic, the constraints, the lockdowns, the quarantines of various kinds, and the economic losses, the job losses, the unemployment. And we see that this now is fueling protests where people appear with weapons and the likelihood of this erupting in mass violence is on the increase. One thing that demonstrates a great increase in intensity is the far-right propaganda on the various platforms of the internet, of the social media, the Telegraph, the Gab, and others. The recommendations to cough, to go to synagogues and embrace everybody and cough on everybody if you're infected. The recommendations to utilize, to exploit the weakness of society and carry out attack under the guise of wearing a mask. So, you know, this pandemic that seems to be disempowering everybody is a fuel that fans the flames of hate and the populism and far right. And I think that society needs to embrace against these possibilities and intensify its vigilance and its CVE preventative efforts as well. I'll end with this. Thank you very much for listening, and maybe we can now have some questions if there are any.
Well, colleagues, thank you so much. Really fascinating, and having just finished reading the book, I can say that I think it really, it helps do a few critical things. The book helps to humanize and demystify the experience of those who are radicalizing to violence at the individual level, while understanding the broader context in which those individual stories unfold, and placing those stories into a theoretical construct. And the book does all three of those things. I think it also highlights the potential value of a public health approach to violence prevention when you think about the prevalence of abuse and neglect in the individual stories. Primary prevention efforts could help minimize those abusive experiences provided by teachers or bullies or peer networks. When you think about the importance of secondary prevention aimed at individuals who have suffered abuse and neglect, right, before they go down this road thoroughly, and then the loss of significance after, in the aftermath, after leaving these movements, the importance for tertiary prevention to address those issues. So I think it helps make a case for some practical not solutions, but mitigating efforts as well to deal with these issues. But it also raises a really, I mean, it's just a challenge that I can't get my mind around, no matter how many times I've had similar conversations about how the need to empathize with these individuals in order to allow them to change and disengage from violence, while still dealing with the very real public safety concern that these individuals are actively engaging in high levels of violence in many countries with real victims at stake. And so the need to balance the law enforcement approach with the violence prevention approach is really a critical challenge. So I've got one question from the group, and I'll turn to that, and then I've got other questions in the can, but I'd much rather hear from the audience. The first question, the need stage is reminiscent of a similar stage or set of psychological processes in other types of radicalization, or say joining gangs, or some other alternative religious movements. Can you comment on the way that the need stage in this instance is similar to individuals joining other hazardous occupations or pastimes?
Yes, let me address that. Of course, the need is universal, and what distinguishes the different ways of meeting that need are the specific narratives. And these narratives can be more or less accessible in the individual's environment. And this kind of channels how the quest for significance is accomplished, or how it is, what activities it guides ultimately. David mentioned that many of these neo-Nazis grew up in a milieu, in an environment where the neo-Nazis ideas were very much alive. East Germany, for example, other places where the neo-Nazi idea and the tradition in Germany, the continuity with the Third Reich, made that particular ideology, that particular way of empowerment, of meeting the needs of significance, very, very important. people in a inner city neighborhood in the United States may have other narratives that are accessible to them, joining a gang, becoming an important member of the gang, becoming a macho kind of person that takes risks, that commits crime. That might be the environment in which that kind of narrative is accessible and available and exploited on others. So, the quest for significance is there. The question is, what kind of narrative makes sense? What kind of narrative is available? People with education may have other narratives that are promoted by the mainstream culture. You can, become educated, you can get your degree, you can seek an employment, you have a professional capacity. Some people may not have that they may be more likely to embrace a narrative that does not require that. All it requires them is to join a violent movement, to be violent, to fight others, rather than contribute in any constructive way. So, it all depends. The need is there. All of us have it. It's the channeling of the need that direct one individual to be an Islamist jihadist, another individual to be a neo-Nazi, and yet another individual to be a gang member or a member of a cult.
Thank you. So this is a related question, but I'd love to hear Daniel's take on it in the German context specifically. Does recruitment for right-wing extremist groups increase during difficult times, such as reunification, economic collapse, or refugee influx in Germany, and then the rest of the world? And I'm sure we have various opinions on this, but let's start with Daniel.
Yes, absolutely. So the numbers really point to what we call mobilization opportunities. Here in Germany and Europe at the so-called refugee crisis, which was around 2015, between 2014 and 2016, where large numbers of refugees, asylum seekers came to Germany, we saw at the same time a massive uptick in far-right concerts, rallies, publications. So all of their activities to recruit new members skyrocketed at the same time. And also at the same time, far-right violent acts like arson attacks, explosives attacks, assassinations, violent attacks also skyrocketed. So we see that once you do have societal mobilization activities, opportunities, that could be immigration crisis, that could be gun legislation, that could be a pandemic. So everything that helps the far right to rally their own members and recruit new ones by pointing their finger, their ideological finger, at the government, at refugees, at foreigners, at minorities, at their ideological outgroup, at their enemy, they will do so. And they will do so through recruitment activities, typically music, rallies, anything, online and offline. Right now, for example, during the corona pandemic, we saw a massive increase of far-right extremist online activity targeting youngsters, because obviously they know that the youngsters will spend more time online because they are at home. They cannot go to the school, they cannot go outside and do the usual leisure activities. So that's something that they exploit. Absolutely, yes.
When we look at data in the United States context, this is using the PIRUS dataset, Profiles of Individual Radicalization of the United States. One thing that our research team has learned is that for those who go on to engage in violence themselves at the individual level, one of the near necessary conditions appears to be a belief in a collective sense of victimhood, that they are part of a victimized community. And in the discussion, we talked a bit about victimization. Primarily in this discussion, we talked about it as one of the things that happened after people were in the movement, that they felt that they were continuing to feel, or they were feeling discrimination because of their decision to be a part of the movement, to wear the clothing or speak out publicly or demonstrate, and that while the rest of us might just look at this as obvious consequences for joining a violent extremist movement, that probably double down on that sense of collective victimhood that they were experiencing at the hands of something like immigration and refugee influxes, a loss of a German identity. And so I think it makes sense to Daniel's points that at times of crisis, whether that's COVID related or geopolitical, victimhood narratives can be more effective. And once I've sold you victimhood as the propagandist, it's much easier for me to sell you violent empowerment as the solution. So that tracks. At the same time, there are other scholars who've highlighted, famously David Rappaport, that there can be other mobilizing factors, such as unmet hope, unmet expectations that things are actually going to get better. And so you have some sort of political change that you think is going to change things for the better. Your hope is up here, and then the reality doesn't quite meet it, and you fill that delta with violence. And so I think that while crises are one source of opportunity for propagandists and recruiters, they're not the only, right? These are opportunistic groups and movements that try to make the best of things. So I've got a question for you, David. I'll pick on you now to hear a different voice. And I want to just ask a methodological question, and it has to do with those that you were able to interview for lots of very reasonable, for understandable circumstances. The 36 individuals interviewed were those who had successfully disengaged for a significant period of time. And therefore, they're not necessarily representative of the rest of the movement, right? Those who are either still involved or haven't, who tried to disengage and became recidivists. So what do you think that understandable selection bias does to the results of the study, right? What might your results not say about those who have tried to get out of the movement and have failed to get out of the movement, or just who haven't had those negative experiences to a significant degree that they've chosen to leave?
It's a good question. I think theoretically, the same variables and factors would be operating, but just be in a little bit of a different way. We would assume that the people who decided not to leave and stay, they didn't experience these type of circumstances that threatened their need for significance, or that threatened their need for community, or this need for ideology. And as a result, the organization continued to provide them with these things. In terms of those who have tried to leave but have then re-engaged, I would say these are the individuals who were unable to successfully find an alternative route in which they could feel significant and to deal with that in a different manner. So the people that we had spoken to and that we interviewed are those who were able to find these other outlets. They're able to fight back against the far right, engage in those speaking engagements. They were able to maybe start a family or work on their education, and they were able to fill that. The need for significance is a universal motivator that we are all striving for, and they were able to find it in an alternative route. And I would say the people who re-engage are those who probably are less successful at finding those alternatives, and as a result, they might go back in, would be one viable option there.
Okay.
I would also say, while you're thinking of coming up with a question or looking, you had an earlier point about how tertiary programs can really be helpful in helping people to deal with these feelings of insignificance. And that's one thing we actually tested in our analyses. Half of the people that we interviewed had actually used those tertiary programs to help leave the movement, and the other half hadn't. And so we did some analyses to understand what effect does using one of these programs have on your successful leaving of the movement. And we found kind of two really interesting things. One was that if you used a movement, you actually experienced greater violence from your other comrades. And so we took that to show, like, my decision to use a CVE program is showing how committed I am and dedicated I am to leaving. And so your comrades are going to react more harshly against you with more violence to try and prevent that from happening. But then we also found that those who used CVU programs reported lower levels of insignificance. So they might be experiencing these hardships, but they're also provided with the tools and the relationships and the mechanisms to help them reintegrate more successfully into society. And as a result, allows them to better deal with those feelings of insignificance afterwards.
I also wanted to add to what David was saying in terms of staying versus leaving in the movement. You know, there's a kind of a conflict of two forces. One is the force to stay, which is fulfilled by the fact that they feel empowered in the movement. They have some kind of camaraderie in the movement. And then on the other hand, the force to leave, you know, feeling sometimes betrayed by the ideology, sometimes betrayed by the colleagues. The wear and tear of being in a movement like that is also very substantial. And whereas the quest for significance is a very important force, it's not the only force. At some point, the quest for comfort, for relationship, for love also takes over, and people are tired and weary. And you know, the average length, according to reports, in a neo-Nazi movement, the average length is about 10 years, which is still very long, but it's not forever. People at the end, you know, have other things that being in the movement that may be very satisfying with testosterone high youngsters may not be as fulfilling to people who would like to have a family, have comfort, have some love and affection in their lives. So, you know, there's a kind of battle of different psychological forces that determine whether they will stay or leave and how long will they stay.
So the next question, make sure I'm not muted. Okay. The next question, you're finding that the majority of these dedicated long-term neo-Nazis were raised around the influence of right-wing extremists is really interesting. To what extent do you see this result as limited to your sample of leaders in a particular time and place, or do you see this as more generalizable? Further, do you see evidence of the same phenomenon among young neo-Nazis today in Germany or elsewhere, or among less dedicated participants? So several questions there, but how universalizable do you think the experience of your sample, which again were people who were in the movement for a long time and then had been out of the movement for a long time, tended to be senior leaders or on that edge of the spectrum, how generalizable in other times and places with younger people and for less dedicated participants?
David, do you want to address that?
Sure. I would say first, only about half of the people that we interviewed were in leadership positions. So although everybody that we did interview had a sustained career, only half of them did rise to those leadership positions. So I don't know if it's fair to say that all of them were in these really high level positions. Others were people who just, you know, sometimes they jumped around from different type of organization. They maybe started kind of in a skinhead, more music related venue, and then they switched to a different organization a few years later that was more ideological, more political. But I think we have a good mix of individuals in there that would suggest that it would be more generalizable than it might appear at the beginning. I would also say in terms of, I mean, we tend to see that a lot, just generally speaking, beliefs and ideologies tend to cluster in different locations. So I think here, even in the US, we see that there are states and areas in the US, in the southern United States, for instance, where certain beliefs about maybe the Confederacy or certain things are going to be more prominent than in other locations, and people are going to be exposed to these more types of ideas. And so it's not uncommon for people to be raised in hate, not just the people who are leaders, but people more generally. I think we see that not just in the neo-Nazi movement in Germany, but also far right here. We talk about people in the jihadist groups who had this bred in the bone, is how they were radicalized and how they were kind of socialized into feeling this way as well. So I think generally speaking, that should be fairly universal and generalized. I don't know if Daniel can speak specifically to far right youth in Germany. That was kind of your second part of your question. now, he would be better able to address that component of it.
In fact, in Germany, we saw something of a subcultural turn in recent years, where membership numbers in youth-oriented subcultural groups like skinheads, like what we call autonomous nationalists, identitarians, so all the bunch of not really party and like party organizations or strictly hierarchical official associations have become much more important to the far-right scene than those political parties, actually. I would say that in recent years, the far-right scene has branched out a lot, diversified a lot. In Germany, we've seen things that I'm pretty sure you in the US will see in a couple of years, be it neo-Nazi hip-hop and rap music or techno music, dozens of different clothing brands catering to all different lifestyles, dedicated neo-Nazi brands produced by neo-Nazis for neo-Nazis. We have seen so many different styles that directly target youngsters, teenagers, adolescents with every kind of lifestyle choice they have, that I'd say that the youth perspective, the teenager perspective has become even more important, always has been important in the German far-right, but in recent years, let's say the last 5 to 10 years, they've really, really stepped up the game when it comes to recruiting youngsters.
Arie, I've got an interesting question. How can the quest for significance model explain why a few people pursue violence while most people do not? I find that most models and theories are unable to adequately do this.
You know, it's a conjunction of the three factors that come to head in a given individual's life. The great either loss of significance or this great opportunity for heroism and martyrdom that is somehow striking the right note at a given time. The availability of the narrative that suggests what to do about it. The support of comrades. You can be watching maybe a video, a sermon of some jihadist cleric that is very fiery and very compelling and touches your quest for a macho heroism, and at that point you commit and you act. And so it's coming together of these three things. It's a big commitment. Extremism is generally explained psychologically by a motivational imbalance. That is, that one thing becomes so important that other things are pushed aside. And we see that with all kinds of extremisms. But with this case, the quest for significance, the opportunity to become an important person from the doldrums of humiliation, all of a sudden becomes so important that you are willing to sacrifice everything. Most people do not want to sacrifice everything. People have a set of basic needs. Most people want to maintain those needs. So it takes a special moment, a special conjunction of these three factors that come at the right time with the right magnitude to create that kind of commitment. So it's not surprising, because extremism, all kinds of extremism are very rare phenomena. Almost by definition, extremism is a fringe phenomenon. And that is because of this motivational imbalance. One thing becomes so important, then you are willing to sacrifice everything else. And that, that is rare. Most people want to have it all, and that's what moderation means, that you try to somehow balance life and work and significance. And we're not great heroes, but we at least have some kind of balance in our lives.
Daniel, a question for you, given the really interesting survey of CVE in Germany that appears in the book. In the German context, and then perhaps we could broaden it out, but in the German context, how important are formers or ex-violent extremist group members in preventing those who are vulnerable to radicalizing from joining a neo-Nazi movement?
That's a very interesting question. I'm fully aware of that. There is currently an international debate about the role of formers in CVE, and many countries have rushed to formers as some kind of silver bullet solution when it comes to extremism of various forms. And I got to tell you that in Germany, the role of formers in CVE programs is very limited. There are some non-governmental organizations who actually are built on the model of employing formers as mentors or counselors. But I have to say these are the absolute minority. Most of the programs in Germany, in particular the governmental programs, work with professionally trained experts, psychologists, political scientists, social workers, police officers of various different branches and disciplines. And as in Germany, a field has developed in recent decades where we are roughly aware of what kind of practical, academic or knowledge, otherwise skills we know for to help these individuals to leave the movement. We also are aware of the risks when involving formers, and there are many, many of these risks. Now, there's a different area when formers are engaged in early prevention, primary prevention, like counter narratives or giving talks in schools, completely different area. But when you talk about tertiary de-radicalization programs, here in Germany, the overall majority of opinion is that it's rather critical. We usually do not have former extremists as active mentors and de-radicalization counselors. Just a couple of reasons. The risk of re-traumatization for these formers is very high. Second, they often have criminal careers. So for a governmental program or another high-level program, they can turn out to be a publicity risk when they engage in any kind of other illegal activities. Thirdly, and even I think most importantly, if you think back from a holistic de-radicalization perspective, what you want as a goal for your clients of a program is that they end up in life where they have nothing to do with the former extremist past. A former who makes a living out of his extremist or her extremist past, for our perspective, is de-radicalization halfway. They are cemented, they are solidified in their professional former identity, which means that they can never really detach from their extremist past. They will continue on and on and on to relive their extremist past, their extremist background, and they will use still the same way of thinking. And for many formers, this is not the goal you want to have for a full de-radicalization process. So some programs give them the opportunity for a limited amount of time, just 1, 2, 3 years, to earn a little bit extra while they're doing, for example, another educational vocational training, to use the experience, for example, in school workshops, etc. But overall, I got to say that the German experience is more or less that formers have a role in counter-narrative and primary prevention, but not as professional de-radicalization mentors.
It's very interesting. In the United States context, the lack of significant government or federal programming means that it's often formers who have stepped up to try to do interventions, often in the online sphere, identifying people flirting with the ideology and trying to off-ramp them. And it's, with mixed results. And obviously some really inspiring programs out there and others that are concerning for many of the reasons you've suggested. So thank you. That's really interesting.
Well, I can add to that, this is basically the European situation 20, 30 years ago. We had the same, basically formers started these programs because they were saying we need this kind of help out of a need to do attitude, right? Do it yourself attitude. But since then, we have professionalized significantly. Programs have gained experience and knew what kind of professional training is simply required. And just compare that to the US situation. You need special expertise and training. This is highly complex and even dangerous work. You cannot just go out there and talk to a convicted terrorist in prison and try to change their mind. I mean, there's so many different risks involved that you better really start thinking about offering solid, high-level training to build a pool of experts, practical experts and academic experts that are specialized in de-radicalization before you actually go on and on and on, years and years and years with a very unprofessional landscape of, varying quality. I mean, people mean well, but they need to be trained. They need to have professional backgrounds to do this kind of work. And Arie, you as a psychologist, you know that. I mean, it's talking with people about changing their beliefs and behaviors. It's highly complex and risky thing to do.
Okay, it is 11:32. Very cognizant of everybody's time. I do have one more question, and I'll pose it. But just because I know people may have to move on with their day, I did want to thank everybody in the audience for joining us. And before people do check out, thank our three wonderful colleagues for a very interesting webinar, but a very good book. So the last question, and then we'll call it for the day. Has Daniel noticed a difference between Islamists and neo-Nazis in the patterns of personal stories of abuse and neglect before entry into the movement?
Actually, I didn't. I think that the psychological processes involved in radicalizing into these two different environments are very similar. Obviously, the way it manifests, the way it addresses the needs and narratives, for example, is different. For the Salafi jihadi environment, there's a religious conversion involved, which means a lot more psychologically than simply joining a skinhead group, for example. But yeah, I mean, these people, they come from various different backgrounds. They have a mixture of push and pull factors that brings them into a contact, as Arie would say, a quest for significance. And they all have that. All different extremist environments have that to different degrees. And some are more looking for like a religious philosophy. Some are looking more for action, adventure, or violence in a neo-Nazi environment. So it boils down a lot to the individual preference and push and pull factors. But to give you another example that shows how similar these environments are, I'm currently involved in a study looking at extremist side switchers, so people who move between hostile extremist environments, neo-Nazis turning out jihadis, or left-wing terrorists turning out neo-Nazis. It doesn't mean that it's simply exchangeable and the ideology doesn't matter at all. On the contrary, what they look for is specific ideological components like anti-Semitism or the role of violence and masculinity. And these things for them build the ideological highways between these different milieus where they move back and forth.
Thank you. Gentlemen, again, thank you for what is a very timely book, and hopefully not too timely, but given all the uncertainty produced by COVID-19, as Arie was saying earlier, we are seeing some of those sort of drivers or enabling conditions for greater societal mobilization into these extremist movements. And I hope your book helps us understand what the perils and the opportunities are for addressing it. Thanks everybody for your time. And we hope to see you at the next webinar. Take care.
Thank you very much. Thank you, START. Thank you, Bill.
Thanks.